Hey everyone, I am here with Marina Jenkins. She's the executive director of the National Democratic Redistricting Committee, which is one of the key organizations involved in the fight to make sure that your vote is protected. Marina, thank you for doing this. Tell us what your organization is and how it fits in this world of protecting voting rights.
Sure. So the National Democratic Redistricting Committee is an organization that was founded in 2017 by President Barack Obama and Attorney General Eric Holder, who is our chairman, and Speaker Nancy Pelosi. And it was formed after what President Obama called the shellacking of 2011 and 2012, when Democrats didn't really have a comprehensive strategy around redistricting. And the Republicans did. And the Republicans had something called Red Map in 2011. And that was a strategy where they started investing in state legislatures who are responsible for redistricting. And in order to gain power at the state level, in order to manipulate the maps that determine representation at the federal level here in Congress. So after that really created a lot of difficulties for President Obama during his first term. We all remember those fights, and so the goal was to create an organization that would look at redistricting comprehensively. So we do, along with our affiliates, we do grassroots organizing, we do political work, and we have an affiliate, the National Redistricting Foundation, which brings cases against gerrymanders in states where we want to fight for people's voting rights.
Right. And, I think a lot of people have heard the word gerrymandering, but they don't necessarily know what redistricting is. Can you explain to us what is redistricting, when and why does it happen, and how do we ensure it's fair?
Yeah, redistricting is basically after the census, every 10 years, we get new population numbers. So the census determines and counts every person in the United States, and then we reallocate seats in Congress to the states to make sure that we live up to the promise of the principle of one person, one vote. And so that is the idea that everybody in this country at the state level and at the federal level should get equal access to representation. So our congressional seats, the number of people that you represent should be the same as the number of people that your colleague down the hall represents. And it's the same at the state ledge level. Redistricting is done nationally at a state level. So it's a patchwork of processes. So every state has a different process. In New Mexico, there's a commission that helps with the redistricting. Unfortunately, in states like Texas, it's still a purely political battle. And so from state to state, our organization goes in and comes up with the right strategy to try to fight gerrymandering, to try and ensure that people are getting accurate representation and that the will of voters is realized. Because what happens is if you have a party that is able to manipulate the maps and draw districts around people, they're able to basically determine and pick their voters and predetermine election outcomes instead of a situation where the voters get to pick their politicians and decide how they want to be represented.
Yeah, so I think it's really important that people know. I mean, when we talk about gerrymandering, we're literally talking about drawing maps. When these legislatures and these commissions at the state level look at these maps, I mean, there is very much political forces at play and bad actors inside those systems who are saying, okay, how do we make sure we get all the Republicans in one district? Or they'll even draw lines around houses, neighborhoods. And that's where the concept of gerrymandering comes from. And historically, there was intentional gerrymandering. They would draw out entire communities. And of course, that comes out of the history of this country and excluding certain voters from voting.
Right.
And so talk to us a little bit about the Voting Rights Act and how important the innovations were in the 60s and 70s to protect voting, to make sure that it's one person, one vote, and that you actually have representation in Congress, and how that's protected in the law.
Yeah, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was a landmark moment, just a watershed moment in the fight for civil rights in this country. And it remains the strongest voting rights law that we have on the books. And among other things, the Voting Rights Act has a provision called Section 2, which prevents the dilution of the voting power of protected communities. So largely that's communities of color, and it ensures that those voters cannot be drawn in or out of districts. We call it cracking and packing. So you can't crack a community, which is to say split them up into several different communities so that their voice is diluted, or alternatively you pack them all into just one district and their voice is also diluted then, because relative to the state that they're in, they're only getting to have influence in a smaller number of seats. And so the Voting Rights Act protects those communities from that kind of gerrymandering, and protects the right to vote, and it gives us a tool to be able to fight back when we do have these extremely rigged maps that we're seeing right now happening in Texas.
And part of the reason why the Civil Rights Act was and the Voting Rights Act was passed was because gerrymandering happens at the state level. And so it was federalized, it was nationalized to protect civil rights and the rights of all Americans to access the vote at the national level, because there were certain states and places where the right to vote was not being protected. And that's why it's a federal law. And that's why we're standing in front of the Supreme Court, because when states violate the law, when they crack and pack, when they draw communities out of maps or into maps, ultimately court cases can be brought first at the state level, and then on appeal, they end up here at the Supreme Court. So talk to us about the legal process. What happens if a state breaks the law, and especially the Voting Rights Act?
Yeah, if a state breaks a law, voter advocacy groups and individual voters themselves, and in an appropriately oriented Department of Justice, can bring a lawsuit against that state for that gerrymander. And we've had great success. Our affiliate has brought cases out of Alabama, the case out of Louisiana, that achieved new representation for Black voters in those two states, in Alabama and Louisiana, and are also pursuing litigation already in Texas. We know the Texas legislature is currently undergoing a special session to try to gerrymander the state even further, but that state is already the subject of litigation. Their congressional map is already being challenged for violating the Voting Rights Act and not providing sufficient representation to Latino voters in Texas. And so, what you see after, if you get a situation where a state passes a gerrymandered map, there is this recourse. And in 2023, very recently, the Supreme Court actually reaffirmed that Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is still good law in a case called Allen v. Milligan, which is a case out of Alabama. And, unfortunately, the state of Alabama continue to fight, continue to push back. So we are going to be back in the Supreme Court in the next term for another round that that state of Alabama is trying to get another bite at the apple before the court in Alabama. And in Louisiana, the Supreme Court just last month punted on issuing a decision in the redistricting case out of that state. So we'll actually have both of those states having cases back before the Supreme Court in the coming term, as well as North Dakota. There's a decision from the Eighth Circuit, you may recall, where the Eighth Circuit decided that individual voters and voting rights organizations don't have standing to bring these cases, and only the Department of Justice does, which is so out of line and out of step with, precedent and decades of practice under the Voting Rights Act. And so that also is a case that's going to come before the Supreme Court. So we have a huge term coming up this coming year for the Voting Rights Act, and protecting it is one of our top priorities.
Well, and I just want to emphasize that a little bit, is folks need to know that the Department of Justice is not the personal attorney for the White House or any individual serving in the federal government. The DOJ is your attorney, the people's attorney. They're there to enforce federal law. They are the federal enforcement body to go to the courts and protect the American people's rights. And that's why what is happening at DOJ is so problematic. And in this world, the Trump administration has literally dismantled the Civil Rights Division intentionally. They've actually either put people on administrative leave, they've moved them to other cases, or basically told them, if you don't want to work on these cases, go find another job. And so they are actually taking away the people's rights inside of the federal government that would litigate these cases. So that's why it's more important than ever that we have the affected parties, communities, organizations on the ground, tribes, others who might be affected by these gerrymandered maps bring these cases so that they can be litigated. But here in the Supreme Court, it's kind of a mixed bag, because this current majority, and it's worth noting that we have a number of justices that were appointed by the current president, are kind of going out of their way procedurally to either punt, to not have to rule on the substance of the law, or basically use time to run out the clock. And so one of the risks in this redistricting effort to steal the election is that they could punt on taking up these cases, and it's already too late. People have been redistricted. The election happens in 26, and we're actually in a lot of trouble. So talk to us about what can be done. A lot of people are scared right now. How can they get involved? What kinds of organizations should they think about supporting? And also, what can people do inside their own communities?
Yeah, absolutely. As I noted, if and when a bad map passes, it will be challenged by, our affiliate, as well as similar organizations. The case out of the 8th Circuit is a case out of North Dakota that the Native American Rights Fund has been litigating, along with Campaign Legal Center. NAACP LDF is, a huge champion against these maps. There are just a number of organizations, including the National Redistricting Foundation, that really put blood, sweat, and tears into these cases and fighting for voters' rights. But there is so much more that people can do. In Texas, for example, we're currently telling folks to call your state legislator. As you noted, these are state issues, these are state questions, and so the state legislators get to decide how these maps are drawn and whether they're going to bend the knee to Donald Trump, who is asking Texas to redraw their map, or stand up for Texans. And so in Texas and nationally, you can text ACTION to 36787, and we can provide that. But the key is to just make your voice heard, make sure that you want fair maps, and make sure that you communicate that you want fair maps, and get that message out, share it with your friends and family. Same as anything, just redistricting can sometimes feel like a wonky issue, but it is so important. It is the foundation to every right we have and want to protect. And any issue that you care about, we're only going to see progress on those issues if we have representative government. There are so many issues where actually most Americans agree. Reproductive rights, climate action, like there are so many issues where actually most people would agree, but you get these extreme situations, and you get representatives in both Congress and the State House that won't listen to the people because they don't feel like they have to, because the maps have been rigged to ensure that they will get elected again and again, when they're not actually legislating according to what people want. And so all of the issues that you might care about are impacted by whether or not we have fair maps. So make sure to get involved and tell your friends.
And I think I just want to end on this, which is that the promise of democracy is that every person's vote matters. And I think a lot of Americans right now feel like their vote doesn't matter. But let me just say this: if the Republican establishment and Donald Trump didn't think your vote mattered, they wouldn't be spending millions of dollars in trying to rig the system to steal your vote. They know your vote matters. And that's why we need to speak up, speak out, fight back, get involved. If you live in Texas, Missouri, Florida, or any of the states where they're trying to gerrymander the maps, you need to speak up, speak loud, call your state legislature, get involved with organizations, and protect the right to vote, because it is our most sacred and our most important right here in these United States.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.